I'm Rachel Simmons. I'm the chair of the Department of Art and Art History. And let's see, I've been here about 10 years, believe it or not. This is the best place on earth to work, and I'm going to demonstrate why. I'm going to show you all the wonderful things I've been able to do while I've been here. I am going to talk a lot about Antarctica, but I thought before I got to Antarctica, I would talk a little bit about the things I did before I got there. So in 2005, I decided to go to Antarctica, and I wrote my proposal for the McCain grant, thinking this is one of those places, this is one of those opportunities that is a once-in-a-lifetime deal. And I was thrilled to be able to go to Antarctica. It was a wonderful experience. And these are the reasons I went. I really wanted to make some work based on my observations. I wanted to look at ecotourism, particularly as I've been an ecotourist now on several different trips. And climate change, and this is a good place to look at climate change. And it's tourism. That's just the main reason to go. So I did some research before I went on the benefits of ecotourism. One of the main benefits is the idea that tourists to these places then become ambassadors. And even in the brochures that the company that I've traveled with hand out, we become polar ambassadors when we come back. And I think to a certain degree that's true. A couple people in here went with me to Antarctica last year. I think you do, you tend to want to save a place that you've been to. You tend to care a little bit more about some place if you've had a personal connection to it. The other thing is this idea, E.O. Wilson's idea of biophilia, right? That we need to be in contact with wild places, that it recharges us, that without doing that on a regular basis, we become disconnected from nature, which is not a good thing, right? When we become disconnected from nature, we can be very callous about how we conserve nature. And when you go to Antarctica, you can't help but understand that there's a lot of science going on, like really important science. And so the idea is that tourists will then support those scientific initiatives because they understand the importance of it having been there. And this is really important. Local economies, the economy of Ushuaia, which is the southernmost city in Argentina, I would say is very much dependent on Antarctic tourism. And that town probably would wither and go away if the industry went along with it. So it does support local economies and sometimes gives them a green option, right? Instead of an industrial base for their economy, they can have this sort of tourist base. Now there are undesirable impacts of ecotourism as well. And all of that factors into my work. As an artist, I'm critical of the things that I engage in so that I can make good art about those things. So these are some of the things that can happen with any ecotourist operation. You can disturb wildlife, you can trample vegetation, you can, they used to take tourists to scientific bases, they don't really do that anymore. Well, not scientific bases that are actively doing science. They have, your ship can sink, which has happened a couple times down there. You also, and this is the big one for me, when you travel these places, you generate carbon by going there, right? So the ice you go to see, you're accelerating the melting a little bit more. And that's a dilemma, right? I mean, you don't want that to be part of the package, but it is. No matter where you go, you leave a footprint. So that's something that I take very seriously. And then I think a lot about when I'm making these plans to travel and make work. So just a little bit about what's been happening in the tourist industry or around the tourist industry in Antarctica. This is mainly based on peninsular tourism, which is the heart of the tourist industry there. We had over 45,000 tourists in 08, 09, and that number probably went well above 50 in the last couple of years. Penguin populations have been decreasing, and they're still doing research on that. They're not pinning that solely on tourist activity. Climate change has an awful lot to do with it as well. There was a ship that sank in 2007 in the Bransfield Strait, which created an environmental problem, right? The ship is still down there at the bottom of the strait. The Ushuaia, there's a ship called the Ushuaia, ran aground right before I left for Antarctica, which freaked my mother out pretty good. But that happens all the time, actually. The weather can change so rapidly, and some of the bays are so shallow. The ships run aground, which means they make contact with the bottom, and they either have to wait for the tide to change or have another ship kind of nudge them off of the shallows. And that's disruptive to wildlife as well. Before the Antarctic Treaty just passed an edict they would like to limit passenger ships to 500 passengers per ship. Before that's put into place, and this is the last year before that is put into place, that regulation, there are ships that carry 3,000 passengers or more down there. You've probably seen the Royal Caribbean ship now that's out that carries 6,000 passengers. It has a water park and actual live planted oak trees on the ship, all kinds of things like that. That ship's not going to Antarctica, but that's what we're talking about in terms of cruises, the cruise industry becoming bigger in size. So the Antarctic Treaty countries create these guidelines for all the tourist operations there, and they took a look at that trend and didn't like it, right? So they've scaled back passenger ships to 500 passengers per ship, which is still a big ship. The ship that I've been on twice is only a 100 passenger ship. And the smaller the ship, the smaller the footprint, right? And then my question, as I went in the first year, 2008, I really wanted to know how many of the people I was traveling with were going to go home and talk about issues like marine pollution, climate change, and conservation, or how many were there to check off their seventh continent. A lot of them, as it turns out, are there to check off their seventh continent. Antarctica always being left to the last on those sorts of lists because it's so hard to get to. It's expensive. And so I wanted to get a sense of what the average Antarctic tourist was like, right? Because they're not all going down there to do research. They've got other reasons to go. So that's sort of an overview of some things going on in the tourist industry. So if you're looking to study climate change, this is the place, right? The North Pole is the other place. But here, temperatures have risen 3 degrees Celsius over the last 50 years. That's pretty warm. That's one of the reasons that many of the penguin populations are decreasing and they're moving further south, pushing out other populations. There's not as much ice, and the ice supports so much wildlife. It supports the krill, which is the bottom of the food chain. And from there on, it supports seals and whales and all sorts of things. So less ice is less wildlife. And so this is a really important issue, particularly in the peninsula. So, you know,
you didn't stay on the boat the whole time, did you?
We sleep on the boat.
Yeah.
It's like our hotel. We get off the boat, though. We get to go on these zodiacs, these little rubber vessels, and you can go on landings for about 3 hours at a time. And they're designated spots, and you can't walk here, and you can't walk there, and you have to be respectful of wildlife. And I don't know, I thought this trip, I didn't see any passengers really breaking any of those rules. They were very well behaved. My last trip, there was a guy who was not following the rules.
Yeah.
Very strict.
And how was the boat like run in regards to like the environment? Like, did they try, like, what did they do like in, like, to protect the environment? Like, did they recycle on the boat, or like how did they?
They recycle bins all on the ship. They, excuse me, they give you a lecture on climate change and tell you exactly how much carbon you're using on the ship. They offset your flights for you as part. They offset your ship's journey. They buy carbon credits through native energy to offset your carbon use on the ship, and they encourage you to offset your carbon use for the flights as well. They make you very aware of your environmental impact, and they're very clear about what to do and what not to do. They use the IATA guidelines to educate. You have briefings every time you go on the land about what you can do and what you can't do. And, it's a very good educational tool just to be on a ship like that and understand. And you know, there's still waste. I mean, most ships grind up their food waste and it goes into the ocean. They don't do any garbage, any hard garbage, but all of that does go in the ocean. So you have to think about that when you're